morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. And a very warm welcome to Family Rights Group webinar, Family Decision Making. If you want to change outcomes, change the way decisions are made about children. I'm Angela Fraser-Wicks. I'm Chair of Trustees at FRG and founding member of their Parents Panel, one of their expert panels made up of people with lived experience of the child welfare and family justice system. And I'll be your host for today. For those who don't know FRG or what we do, firstly, I'd suggest taking a look at our website, which has been recently revamped and contains information and resources for both families and practitioners. We also run a free advice line and details of that will be in the chat. But here's a very, very brief description. Family Rights Group promotes policies and practices that keep children safe within their families and strengthen the family and community networks of those children who can't live at home. We campaign for families to have their voice heard, to be treated fairly, and help early to prevent problems escalating. We are a charity that advises parents, grandparents, relatives and friends about their rights and options when social workers or courts make decisions about their children's welfare. We work with parents whose children are in need or at risk or are in the care system, and with wider family members and friends who are raising children, known as kinship carers. We are the secretariat to the all-party parliamentary group on kinship care. We run our parents and kinship panels, and 50% of our board of trustees are those with lived experience of the child welfare and family justice system. In the 1990s, we introduced family group conferences to the UK from New Zealand. We provide training and consultancy packages. Information about that will be shared later on. And we also run the accreditation. Leading on from our experiences with family group conferences, we designed the Lifelong Links model, which aims at building long-lasting support networks around children in care. And there will also be more information about this in the chat. Please feel free to ask questions. Speaking of the chat, please feel free to introduce yourselves to one another in the chat. For those who are new to Zoom, you will find it usually at the top of your screen in the form of a little speech bubble. If you click on that, and the conversation will open to you. We have staff monitoring and responding to questions throughout the event. Once Paul has finished speaking, if there's time, we will get his thoughts on the themes and answer to some of the questions. Throughout the event, only myself and Paul will be visible on the screen, but I want to quickly introduce the other staff members we have here today so that you can put a face to the names in the chat. Firstly, we have Kathy, Pam and Sean. If they'd like to say a quick hello.
Hi, I'm Kathy, I'm Chief Exec of Family Rights Group. Welcome.
Hi, I'm Pam Ledward. I'm Principal Social Work Advisor at Family Rights Group. Welcome.
Hi, I'm Sean Hursnip. I'm Practice Lead for Family Group Conferencing and Lifelong Links at Family Rights Group. Welcome,
Brilliant.
everybody.
Thanks, Sean. And also on providing tech support with us today, we have Lucy and Andrew. If they'd like to say a quick hello too.
Hello. I'll leave it at that.
Hi, Andrew West.
Brilliant. And behind the scenes, who we can't see, but are equally very valued members of the team today, we have Jordan and Joe on comms, and we have Anne Harrod, who will be popping up in the chat. So on today's event, the Independent Review of Children's Social Care in England recommended in their May 2022 report that a new legal entitlement to family group decision making should be introduced before a case reaches the public law outline, so that a family-led alternative plan for taking care of the child can be considered before a care order is presented by the local authority to the court. Today's webinar will be exploring family group decision-making and how to best involve families in decision-making processes with our speaker, Paul Nixon. Paul has been involved with family group conferences since the early 1990s. He's worked as a senior service manager responsible for strategy and effectiveness in West Berkshire, and then as assistant director in North Yorkshire and Hull. He was chief social worker at the Ministry for Children New Zealand from 2011 until 2018, and has worked in Australia and the United States. During the webinar session, Paul will look to compare approaches in other nations and what lessons we can learn, including how family group conferences can transform children's and families' experiences. So without further ado, it's over to you, Paul.
Kia ora. Thank you, Angela. Tēnā koutou katoa, nā mihi nui ki a koutou. Kei te mihi ki a koutou, nā kaimahi. O nā raupu manaki no reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. ko Conway ti Mona, ko Conway ti Awa, ko Conway ti Rohi, ko Gwynedd ti Iwi, ko Ngāti Cymru ti Iwi, ko Paul Nixon toko ingoa no reira tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou. Kia ora mai tātou. Te aroha, te a whakapono, me te rangi ma rie, tātou e. Te aroha, te a whakapono, me te rangi ma rie, tātou e. Greetings all. It is really lovely to be back in the UK, if only virtually. I just mihi to you as people who care for and work with other people, acknowledge the people you are, where you are, and the work that you do. And also, I just said something about me, the land I'm connected to, the place I'm from, where I was born, the people I'm connected to is actually in Conway in North Wales, where I'm from. So in New Zealand, whenever we meet in any public place, we always speak in Māori first, because New Zealand has 3 languages, Māori, English and sign language. So we always speak in Māori first to recognize the First Nations people, the Indigenous people, tangata whenua, people of the land. So it's really lovely to be with you today, and I'm really delighted to be asked by Family Rights Group to come and talk about family decision-making and family group conferences, which I've probably spent most of my professional career on. In fact, it was in 1991, I went down to London. I was working in Darlington in County Durham as a social worker. I went down to London to an FRG seminar to hear about this approach of making decisions with families called family group conferences. And I sat for 3 days in a group of people from all over the country who were learning about this way of working. And about the end of at the end of the 3rd day, I was standing outside with another social worker smoking a cigarette, and I said, this is really interesting, but it's never going to work here. And it took me some time to realize that what we were doing already, forget FGCs, what we were doing already in the current system really wasn't working, and we need to do something different. So really that's been my interest in family group conferences, is to think about how can we change relationships with family and community, and how can we reposition ourselves in helping families to lead and make their own decisions and find their own solutions to the problems that they're living with. So I'm going to be talking about today, and talking about New Zealand and experience there, talking about a couple of other jurisdictions around the world, and of course talking about social work in the UK as well. What I know of, I've worked in government for 28 years. And in the last couple of years, I've been working for myself, and government looks different from the outside. When you're in government, you think you are reaching out to community, you think you're partnering, you think you're sharing information, you think you're being open. But when you're on the outside of it looking in, it doesn't look the same at all. And that's an interesting lesson, I think. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and I've got some slides to show you and some ideas to share, and looking forward to your questions at the end of this session. So, ngā mihi nui, tēnā koutou katoa, looking forward to this conversation today. I should say it's about 8:30 in the evening here in Wellington, New Zealand. Te Whanganui Tara, the giant harbour, faces south towards Antarctica. And the Wellington harbour is beautiful, but it actually is like a big catcher's glove. So the wind comes up from the Antarctic and it swirls around the harbour, and the weather is forever changing. And they always say Wellington is good on, you can't beat Wellington on a good day, but that's because it's only about 3 or 4 times a year the sun really comes out. The rest of the time is wind and rain. Anyway, I want to talk about some concepts that are on my mind around this question of family group conferences, and hopefully they'll be interesting in sparking some thoughts and ideas. So next slide, please, Lucy. We're just going to show you some slides, and I'm going to talk through those. Some of the key ideas for this morning is, what does partnership mean to everyone involved in the context of our work? And I've got some reflections on social work in the UK and Aotearoa, New Zealand. say something brief about the history of FGCs in Aotearoa, which is interesting, I think, because it tells us maybe a different story or different origins than what we might expect. And then look at the concept of FGCs in a frame of rights, human rights and cultural rights, and how do we understand those rights and work with those rights in the context of statutory social work. To think about the different sorts of mandates that develop in the context of using FGCs and some of the dilemmas and issues that are happening around doing the practice, some innovations, some brilliant stuff happening all over the world, really interesting. In New Zealand, there's increasing use of hui a whānau, which means a meeting of family, which I'm going to talk about as an alternative to an FGC and how those things interface. And then just look at some data internationally and ask some questions about the future. So hopefully we'll get through that in sort of 35 minutes, and there'll be some space for some questions at the end. Next slide, please. So where might we start in thinking about the notion of partnership? Well, there are some very enduring orthodox beliefs around child protection systems, which either are implicit or explicit in the things that we do, in the way we organize ourselves. Agencies are seen as responsible primarily for regulating risk. Professionals that operate or expect to operate as experts and others. The focus is often narrow, focusing on mums and children. Not so often fathers, and even less often wider families, friends and communities around that child or around that family. Professionals define the rules in terms of engagement. Families have to fit into those processes and rules, and there's usually some kind of menu of agency services or imposed or proposed solutions. So the Children Act, and I started to practice under the Children Act, was seen as a very great piece of legislation, well balanced, thoughtful in its construction. And Nigel Parton described it as trying to build a new consensus about the relationship between the family and the state in the care of children and in the protection of children. But one of the things that's striking about the Act is, although it has the notion of partnership implicit in the Act, it's not made explicit in terms of how that will play out in practice. So while the Act was refreshing and new in terms of finding a new balance in child protection, it didn't actually provide us with a mechanism for partnership. It left intact the bureaucracies and the structures and the ways of doing things that didn't really challenge the nature of the relationship between the social worker and the family, in particular, the power relationship that exists between the state and the family. And in that, I think there's a weakness. So concepts of partnership, which are writ large post the Act in terms of messages and research in child protection and further studies that look at the importance of partnership in achieving real change with children and families and communities, it really sits in the hands of the professionals. When we think about the notion of partnership, we should imagine in a real partnership, we trust each other. We influence each other. We change each other's thinking and each other's behavior by the way we connect around a common goal. Both our contributions are equally valued and important in terms of trying to achieve the outcome. So when I look at partnership in practice in child protection, it often looks like social workers trying to change families, or social workers trying to get families to agree to their agenda or agree to their concerns or to agree to how they see the problems, rather than genuinely shifting and changing their thinking and their behavior in this partnership with families. In other words, we're not really talking about partnership. What we're probably talking about is some kind of participation or managed participation in a preset agenda. So how do we rethink partnership? How do we rethink our relationship with families so that genuinely is a partnership and they are leading and influencing and changing the way we practice and the way we think about how we work in partnership? Next slide, please. This is not a partnership. If families are marginalized in the key decisions affecting children, a lack of commitment to the plans of professionals is almost inevitable. This can be quickly misinterpreted by professionals as a lack of family commitment to children. And what quickly develops is a cycle of mistrust and misunderstanding when both sides begins to expect the worst of each other and the relationship or the partnership opportunities to work together break down. there's plenty of studies that talk about undercurrents of disagreement between families and professionals, which remain undercurrents and not explicit in the conversations and relationships they have around decision making and problem solving. There's a fascinating piece of work happening down in New South Wales at the moment, led by a woman called Kate Alexander, who's the chief practitioner. New South Wales is the biggest jurisdiction in the Southern Hemisphere, in the South Pacific, and she's looking at what happens in the relationships with social workers and families and how that leads to care order applications. And what she noticed as she was analysing the data, she's doing a PhD study on this, is that where families were perceived as resistant to the position of social workers or the analysis of the social workers, they were perceived as dangerous or uncooperative or difficult. And that particular variable was the highest correlating factor with application to the court for an order. But actually, when they interviewed the families about the same experiences, what families described was anxiety, big, deep anxiety about a social worker being in the front room, and they saw themselves as trying to protect their child from the social worker. And what Kate calls this is acts of resistance, which I think is a really interesting idea. It's seen as dangerous in families, or it's seen as sort of in denial or uncooperative. But actually, from a family's perspective, it's them trying to protect their children from the over-intervention of the state. And Kate has been working on then how social workers manage conflict and disagreements with families that allow them to have much more constructive conversations about how they work together and how they can actually work in partnership. So my central proposition this evening, is that if we really want to change outcomes for children and their families, we have to change the way we make decisions. Because if we keep making decisions in the same way, we will keep getting the same outcomes. But if we change the way we make decisions and think differently about how we make decisions, then we can genuinely change the outcomes. And there's some real evidence to support that. When you look at the data in places where FGCs are really happening in a well-structured, organized way, and New Zealand's probably the best example, because we do 7,500 FGCs a year and have been doing FGCs since 1990, when I started as a social worker in the UK. So there's a long history of evidence and numbers around things like diversion from court, agreements with families, and reductions of children in public care, and increased numbers of children with family, because there's a different approach to decision making. This, I think, is particularly important for Indigenous people and Black communities who experience different forms of colonization and oppression, where state agencies or organized white groups are taking over, colonizing, occupying the space, and defining how relationships and decision making is done. Next slide, please. So what if our beliefs about children and families were different? What if we took a completely different view on the long-term goals for children, seeing children at the heart of our strategy for social and economic growth? We had a disproportionate investment in the lives of children, and we looked for long-term outcomes over short-term risks. We took a much more long-term view of what needs to happen. We adopted a more holistic lens, in children's identities and relationships as bound up in their families and communities and their culture, and those things you cannot change or take away without doing harm to children. And that we understand that families are experts on themselves. They can find their own solutions with support and good information. They can lead their own way out of troubles. They can make decisions that are right for them, their family, and their culture. And that providing real help to families, working with families in partnership, is a much more protective endeavor than trying to surveil families and control what they do, because that will always be limited, and families won't trust us, and we won't trust them, and we'll never have a partnership. Next slide, please. So when we think about the problems that are coming into social services, whether it's in Australia or in New Zealand or in the UK, what we see is a strong pattern of complex and chronic problems, which are often underscored by things like substance abuse, domestic violence, untreated mental health problems, and more deeply, inequality, poverty, racism, poor health and housing, and social isolation. And these structural conditions deeply affect the well-being and the safety of families, and therefore children inside those families. And without addressing these structural inequalities and problems, we will not really get to the bottom or the heart of dealing with the problem of child abuse. We can't ignore these factors because they're fundamental in shifting families into adversity and making life incredibly hard. Next slide, please. So what we find is, while those structural needs and issues affecting families are ever present and corrosive on families and their well-being and their relationship, and have big impacts on family functioning, we as professionals tend to focus on the apparent risk or the apparent need, which is a kind of quick fix cycle where we focus on what's the observable or the immediate or apparent risk or problem without addressing the deeper underlying causes that are creating that kind of difficulty for families and that kind of risk for children. So it's an endless cycle of quick fix. These families are endlessly referred back to social services because their enduring problems are much deeper and wider than the sort of fixes we're trying to provide as social workers on the surface. And I think it's always really important to think about the context, because it says so much about children's outcomes in the long term. The next slide, please. So this is Mount Ngauruhoe, and in New Zealand, mountains, Maunga, are sacred for Māori. The mountain is a sacred thing and entity, and they're named in particular ways. And when New Zealand was colonized, the names of mountains were given English names. So Mount Egmont was actually named after Captain Cook. Chose the name Mount Egmont for the second Earl of Egmont. They changed the name of the mountain and didn't tell the local people, which, you know, it's classic sort of colonizing behavior. And the highest and largest mountain in New Zealand is, or was called, Mount Cook. So the very guy who colonized the country and brought all that harm and all that disease and damage to the community, the highest mountain was named after him, by him, Mount Cook. It's now been changed back to its Māori name. So Mount Egmont is now called Taranaki, which means shining peak. And the reason it's called that is it nearly always has snow on it. So Taranaki is a Māori name, and the shining peak is the snow on top of the mountain. And Aoraki means cloud piercer. And that's our biggest mountain in New Zealand. And happily in New Zealand now, as Te Reo Māori is re-emergent in the public domain, in the media, in the news, in all the names of places are being turned back to Māori names, which are far superior and far better than the English names that were given by the colonizers. So Aoraki is New Zealand's highest mountain. And you'll see why that's important in a minute. So something very significant happened in New Zealand in the 80s when Māori people were organizing and bringing to the attention of the government the significant overrepresentation of children in the care system, on social work caseloads, in youth custody, in care, and calling for change. And at that time, the government were reviewing its legislation and were on the point of trying to build a new legislation and have a model of decision-making, which was basically a multidisciplinary team. And that was the early thinking. But Māori organized so well and put so much pressure on the government called a new ministerial advisory committee, and they appointed a Māori social worker to lead that. His name was John Rangiho. And Rangiho took a completely different approach to the review of what was happening than had gone before. He spent time traveling around the country and talking to Māori on the marae, talking about what was happening to children, what was happening to community, what was happening to the language and the culture, and what needed to change. And through that process of real Māori leadership inside the review, and not John himself, John was like a facilitator or a coordinator, traveling around the country, engaging Māori and bringing their voices to the fore. They said, you have to change the way we make decisions. You have to change the way we practice. We have to do something different. Next slide, please. This is the marae, this is in Christchurch, typical picture of marae. Marae is a meeting house. Māori, iwi, whānau, hapu cluster around marae when there are meetings, events, funerals, celebrations. It's an important place for gathering and talking and making decisions. Next slide, please. And this is what the review by Rangio heard. I won't repeat everything that's written there. In 2 years, expected to clean up a 150-year-old mess, an institution of social control. People have been institutionalized and rendered helpless. And the report that was written was called Puao Te Atatu, which means daybreak, and Māori still hold this report in high regard. And what Daybreak did was recommend a real change in terms of the decision-making that took place. And quite quickly, the model of multidisciplinary team was taken out of the legislation, and a Māori way of making decisions, family group conference, was put in the legislation and became law in 1989, exactly the same time as our Children Act in the UK in 1989. It had some very similar ideas around partnership and thinking about supporting families and communities, except distinctively, the Children, Young Persons and Their Families Act, which is the New Zealand legislation, put at the centre of that the concept of a different model of decision-making, which is the family group conference. And that family group conference confers duties, rights and obligations on families, but critically, it's not perceived as a social work method or way of being. It's not perceived as a social work technique or gizmo. It's perceived as fundamentally people's rights in New Zealand, as citizens, as families, as community, as Māori, as tangata whenua, to be able to make their own decisions about their own children before the state can move in and take over. And that completely repositioned the relationship between the state and the family in decisions that were made about children. And the effect of that was that far less children came into care, and far fewer courts heard cases reported to them or heard cases in court because matters were being resolved at the FGC. Indeed, in many cases, if a social worker brought an application and the judge wasn't happy that the FGC hadn't been fully used, they would simply refer the social worker back, go and have another family conference and make a decision with the family to resolve this rather than doing it through the court. So the Act placed a really strong emphasis on family as the key people in the lives of children, but interpreted family broadly, didn't conceive of family as just parents and child, but really placed emphasis on grandparents, uncles, aunties, cousins, family, friends, and all those people connected to the whānau who were connected to the child. And the emphasis in that being the child has a right to their family. The child has a right to be looked after by their family and stay connected to their culture and their community, rather than the state removing them from that. And that would only happen if there was really no other alternative. So next slide, please. So what we see around the world is family group conferences are developing different ways, and it's really fascinating to see. In some legislations, like New Brunswick and some of the Australian states, Tasmania and South Australia, family group conferences are in the legislation, they're the centre of their childcare legislation, but only as an option if the social worker feels that it's the right thing to do, rather than something that the family is absolutely entitled to. There are no other jurisdictions that I know of in the world that have family group conferences as a right to families so centrally placed in their legislation. And the key point about that is not only are people's rights upheld, but there's actually nowhere else to go. You can't go and have another meeting somewhere else and make a decision about a family. Without a family, it's not legal, it's not possible. You have to go to the family group conference, and that means that people have to invest in it. And one of the challenges, I think, in the UK system is we're running these dual systems with family group conferences running alongside statutory care reviews, child protection conferences, planning meetings, and the whole other plethora of meetings there are, giving social workers and the bureaucracy many options, many get-out options and places to go if they don't like the idea of the families making the decisions. In New Zealand, you don't have that option. There isn't anywhere else you can go. The nearest thing you can do to that is a whānau hui, which is a meeting before the FGC. But once a social worker forms a belief there's an issue of care and protection, she must refer under the law, she must refer for an FGC, and I'll come back to that. In other jurisdictions, FGCs are placed in a policy space. So the agency, and I think the City of Leeds is a good example of that, the agency places policy requirements on its staff to make referrals under certain conditions. So if before a child comes into care, or looking at the application of the PLO, or looking at decision making on the edge of care, you have to make a referral. And then in other jurisdictions, FGCs are developed as good practice, where sort of leaders, practitioners are deciding to give this a go and make it work because it seems like a really good idea to involve the family in decision making, and lots of different ways emerging around how that is done. So I've got a friend in France, Francis Alfoldi, who's a social worker, and I've known him for years, and he describes himself as a benevolent coordinator, and he's currently traveling around France in a camper van. He's in retirement now, doing conferences for people in different communities, and he does it for free. He does it as a volunteer, and so he's enjoying touring France, and he stops in a town or a city for a few weeks and does a few conferences for free for the local community, and then moves on. He's like the Lone Ranger of family group conferences. But it's interesting because his construct is this should be outside the state. It doesn't belong to the state. It belongs to families and communities, and actually we need to step back and we need to create more space for community to lead in terms of changing the way we make decisions and the way we work together. There's other examples, like in California, they have a really interesting model where they have two coordinators working under a policy framework. One coordinator does the preparation of the family, goes out and maps the family, sees the family, talks to them, negotiates who's coming and how things will be done and what they're going to do. And the second coordinator is in charge of chairing the conference itself. So they come in as neutral, chair the conference, organize the process of decision making, and the two coordinators work together. So that's like a Californian model. And in some parts of Sweden, they have a male and female coordinator, which I think is interesting. Man and woman working together. That happens in New Zealand sometimes too, having those different roles help people connect at a wider level across wider families, and of course two is often better than one if you're trying to get a lot of work done quickly. Next slide, please. So there was a recent review of New Zealand law. In fact, there's probably been about 4 or 5 reviews since 1989 when the law came in, and there have been various changes, but one thing that has never changed is the place of the FGC. It's endured throughout that time, and in its heyday we were probably doing about 10,000 conferences a year, between 8,000 and 10,000 conferences a year, and that's a lot of conferences over a 30-year period, and it stood the test of time in terms of engagement of family and community in decision making. The Oranga Tamariki Act, which is the latest articulation of legislation, identifies 3 key principles around children. I just thought I'd share this because it's interesting in its construct, because it places and locates children as connected to a wider set of relationships. And that's just not people, that's also place. So for Māori, our relationships are critical to our health and our well-being and our safety. And that's our relationships, that's the sacred relationship we have with each other, but also the relationship we have with the land and the water and the oceans and the mountains and the skies. And of course, in terms of importance for survival and living, those things are just becoming truer and truer. Indigenous people have been telling us for a long time that we have to look at our sacred relationship with each other and our relationship with the land and the water and the mountains and the oceans. And probably the 2 biggest crises facing the world right now are deep inequality across the world, gross inequality, which is damaging human relationships, possibly beyond repair, and of course, global warming and the damage that human behavior is doing to the planet. So actually, these things are entirely true, our relationship with each other, because inequality damages relationships deeply, and our relationships with the land and the sea, and the water, and the skies, and the oceans are really incredibly important. So the legislation locates children in the context of those relationships. Mana tamaiti is the intrinsic value and dignity of every child. derived from their identity and their whakapapa, which is all their connections and relationships, including to places as well as people. That their whakapapa is a multi-generational kinship relationships, connections, and places of identity, where they're from, where they've lived, where their whānau are from, their hapu, their iwi, and whanangatanga, which is the responsibilities and reciprocal obligations all those relationships have around children to care for them, kaitiaki, care for them and protect them. So it conceives of children not as objects in their own right or in isolation, but actually as very connected to land and people and place. And that's how we understand children's relationships and their identity in New Zealand. So one of the things I'm finding in looking at FGC implementation around the world, if you just click twice, we can see both of these. Thank you. Is that for many jurisdictions, it's too big a jump to go from their orthodox child protection systems or their usual ways of doing things to a model of family decision-making with true authenticity and fidelity and integrity in the approach. It's actually too far for people to go, and they really struggle. And what seems to happen in jurisdictions trying to get FGCs going either through a procedural base or a good practice base or even a legislative base, if the conference isn't completely mandated, is it's a long way for child protection social workers to travel. So I'm finding that restorative practices are an interesting and useful theoretical framework to help social workers make a stepping stone between what they normally do, how they could change their relationships and behavior, and then finally get to family decision making, because actually it takes them through a few steps. So I haven't got time here to do work on restorative theory, and I'm sure many of you are super familiar with it. It's happening, it's happening all over the country. But we find that the concepts of restorative are powerful in terms of helping people make a transition, because they bring to center the notion of relationship, and they also provide tools and ways of making decisions that are collective, inclusive, that balance power and allow us to repair harm and repair relationships. So I am finding, particularly in some of the states who are slow to start, introducing restorative practices is an interesting way of helping people then move on to family decision making. I'll say a bit more about that later. Next slide, please. And one of the things that emerges, actually just on that, one of the things that emerges out of those conversations, which I think is really interesting, is the concept of healing in child protection. You know, often we talk about risk assessment, risk management, you know, decision making, placements, permanency, removal. We don't often talk about healing, and without question, harm is being done to children and to their families. And we need to think about the concept of healing. I've been doing these, slight tangent, but I've been doing these healing circles with staff in organizations, and I've been doing them in lots of different places, statutory, non-statutory, businesses, community organizations, and with families and with community groups. And one of the things I've really noticed about what happens in these healing circles is, I'm no expert, I'm just learning, I've done about 30 or 40 of them, is people really express emotion, and nearly everyone cries. And I was quite struck by that, and I didn't understand why at first. I was thinking, what is causing that outpouring of emotion and that sharing and those tears and that, you know, genuine sort of vulnerability? And I think it's the concept of healing. I don't think that we think often about healing and what that means and what we need to heal. Indigenous folk would say you're nearly always in a state of healing, like life does you harm and you're nearly always in a state of healing, but you need to pay attention to it. And you need to think about what makes me heal, what keeps me well. And so it's just quite a striking thing that when you introduce the concept of healing, people open up. And we don't do that much in child protection. We need to do more of that. Next slide, please. So what's happening in New Zealand at the moment? I'm going to talk about New Zealand a little bit, and I'm going to talk about South Australia, where I'm doing a lot of work with some really interesting things happening there and some interesting lessons about the application and the introduction of FGCs. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, Indigenous theory shapes our practice. So what's been developing in New Zealand is a set of approaches that express family leadership, rangatiratanga, family ownership and family decision-making. And there's some really interesting innovations happening around the FGC, which still sits at the heart of our legal decision-making, but new ways of working and developing to express that more earlier on with families or in different contexts. So one of the roles that's been developed in New Zealand is this kairaranga. The kairaranga is the weaver of local knowledge, and they're like community workers. They sit in local communities and they know their community really well. They know the families, they know the local people, lots of rural communities in New Zealand, and lots of defined communities in the city. They stay in these communities, they stay connected, they support people, they help people organize, they help people get resources, but they also become a really important resource. When we're trying to organize family meetings, we can bring the kairaranga in and they can help us find people, connect people and bring people together. It's that kind of community building, community connecting role, which used to be around in the 70s and 60s. Well, it's showing up again, surprise, surprise, and is showing up in New Zealand as a way of keeping families connected and children connected. Whakapapa searchers, so people who really go out and find children's connections, places of interest, places of identity, places of belonging, and really focus on that whole family searching, not just people, places, culture, points of identity, that tell a story about that child's life, that color in that child's life, that help us find the right people to bring together for children and think about what they need, who needs to be involved in decision making, how should we make decisions, where should we make decisions, who can lead it. In the FGC legislation in New Zealand, it says the coordinator can determine the procedure for the conference and can also delegate those functions. So literally it means that the conference can look like anything. It can be different for every family because the law allows that to happen in negotiation between the coordinator and the family. We're seeing increased use of hui whānau, which is a meeting of family. Hui is meeting, whānau is family. And hui whānau are meetings of family where family come together to think about concerns or think about problems and to start to position themselves to get ready for the FGC. It allows them to start to formulate ideas, develop more understanding, build connections and plans. And these hui whānau are leading to sometimes decisions quite quickly that circumvent the need for an FGC, because we've got a plan that's now safe and can work. Social worker can withdraw the referral, or they can go on to the FGC. But I'm interested in the hui whānau development. I don't know how it's going to, where it's going to go in New Zealand, and there's a lot of enthusiasm for it. The risk with hui whānau, I think, if you don't get to the FGCs, there might be key bits of information that the family need, the whānau need, the child needs to make decisions that aren't provided. Because hui whānau is largely a meeting of family with some information input, whereas an FGC is a legal decision-making meeting where agencies have to share the information families need to make good decisions. So there is a risk if hui whānau don't get all the information, but it's interesting practice. The iwis are getting much more involved in service provision. The iwis are the tribes in New Zealand. So there's three core structures in Māoridom. The whānau, which is family in the widest sense, hapu, which is sub-tribe, and then iwi, which is the tribe. And iwi literally means bones, the core of you. And the iwis are organizing their own social services. They're running FGCs. They're co-facilitating FGCs with the government. Currently, the lion's share of delivery of FGCs is still out of the government. There are 250 coordinators in the government in New Zealand running conferences. But one of the criticisms of that is it's become too bureaucratic. It's become too process driven. It's losing some authenticity. It's losing some integrity. We need to return the practice to the community. And there's quite a lot of lobbying going on around this. So we're taking steps towards that in New Zealand with more and more conference coordinators coming from iwis and from social services that are non-government social service providers or from community. The law allows us to use FGCs early, so the best possible referral for an FGC is early, but where the problems are clear or significant. So people often ask the question, which families do I use an FGC for? And that's the wrong question. It's not which families. And the reason it's the wrong question is you don't know. You just don't know which families until you've really had a look. And if you think as a statutory social worker, you can go out and the family will tell you who all the family are, then you're probably overestimating the confidence family have in statutory social workers. They're not going to tell you. If you have someone who's not a statutory social worker, independent, and go and find the family, and that's their only role, they're more successful in finding families. So not which families, but under what circumstances should we refer for an FGC? And increasingly, the EU is wanting to be involved in the evaluation of conferencing so that they can talk about what's important to them in terms of the outcome and what that looks like. Next slide, please. So I did a little bit of international comparisons, what was happening for children in care and kinship care, which is quite interesting. I just tried to compare England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, Australia, and Aotearoa, New Zealand in terms of published data and numbers on rates of care and rates of kinship care. And if the statistics are really interesting if you look at them. Like all stats, they make you ask more questions and think, oh, what does that mean? So if you look at those, you'll see significant variations both in numbers of children in care per 10K and also the kin care rate. You'll see significant variations. So is that about demography or is that about practice? Is that about the way we work or the way we make decisions or about patterns of need out in our community? Well, probably a bit of both. But I think when you look at the research around kinship care, for example, the variance is so great, you have to conclude it's something to do with agency, behavior, and decision making. And what you see in this pattern is New Zealand has the lowest number of children in care and the highest number of children in kinship care. It also has a very high number of children who are placed in kinship care outside of the care system. We have the unsupported child benefit, which is a benefit can be paid straight from income support to families who are looking after relatives without the use of a care order. And one of the things that's concerning, I think, in many jurisdictions is kinship carers being supported through the use of care orders when actually you don't really need a care order, using the care order to access resources for the family, which is a misuse of the legislation. The no order principle in the Children Act has become a no services without an order principle. And that's what it was not intended to be. We need to think differently about kinship care. And, not telling you anything here really, but probably need a distinct service type for kinship care that sits outside government, that's really well resourced, that understands the different profile of the needs of kinship carers, that really can engage kinship carers and work in much more supportive and flexible ways than what the state does in this context. It's something that's screaming at us really, I think. And currently in New Zealand, there's a lot of policy thinking and planning going on around that concept too, because we still have a lot of children in care who are supported in kinship care, as well as numbers of children who are supported outside kinship care. The big criticism, I think, in most places, certainly in New Zealand, in Australia, and probably in the UK too, is that we say we value kinship care, and certainly on a range of outcomes, it seems to do better for children than other forms of placement in care. But we don't support it. We don't give it the financial recognition. We don't give it the practical support. We don't give it the respect and the value it deserves, because it's so important to children. We just hope we close our eyes and cross our fingers and hope it works. And the evidence is really clear on this, is that kinship care placements work best when they're well supported. It's very clear. And we don't do that. And we need to change that dramatically, I think. But if you change the way you make decisions, you can change the outcomes. And I think the stats sort of tell us that a little bit. Next slide, please. So Kathy asked me, what is this slide? What does this mean? And the reason I put this slide in, I just wanted to show you that what's interesting is that the two key places where decisions are made about care and protection in the UK, in England, I've taken as the biggest area in the UK, child protection conferences are 60 per 10K. And in New Zealand, FGCs are 72 per 10K, not much difference. In other words, in New Zealand, we are looking for risk, we are looking for safety, we are dealing with issues around concerns, but we're just making decisions in a different way. It's not like they're not being seen or noticed, we're just making decisions in a different way. And the FGC and the CPC are quite different in terms of their decision-making approach and how they work and what they do. So I just thought it was an interesting little comparison, really. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to read this out because I think it speaks for itself, but I do want to talk a little bit about South Australia because I'm doing a lot of work there at the moment. And there's this amazing Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander leader called Sarah de Crea there, who, if you come to the Kemp conference, you'll hear Sarah speak. She really is an inspirational leader. And she's been leading FGCs in South Australia. And we're just 2 years into the implementation. So we have some raw, unvalidated data, but it's really interesting data. And what we're finding in the implementation is there's quite a lot of tension between the government and this organization who are independent of government, who are providing the conferences. And basically, the government want the conferences fast. They want them quick, they want them clean, they want them fast. And the coordinators are saying, that won't work. That's not going to work for the families in the community. We need to build some trust, we need to build some connection, we need to get people organized, we build some confidence in the process, and that takes some time. So they've resisted the timeframes of the government in the contract on this, and it's caused all sorts of problems. But when I had a good look at the data over 2 years, there's a number of very striking findings in this unvalidated data, but I've seen no reason why it shouldn't be validated soon. The first is that the outcomes are consistent, very consistent in both years. 95% of children who have an FGC are safer, 88% aren't re-referred within a year. Most children are diverted from care and go to family or back to parents. And interestingly, the outcomes for Aboriginal children and the outcomes for non-Aboriginal children are the same. And 50% of the referrals are Aboriginal and 50% are non-Aboriginal. And there's no other service that can say that. Every other service, there's significant disparity between white families and Aboriginal families, but not in family group conferences. And the reason for that is that they're being led by the family, and so the family are determining how things are done. But it's taking longer for Aboriginal families to organize their conference than it takes for white families to do that. And there's a reason for that, because they tend to go wider, tend to consult more, they tend to live more remotely, and they don't trust the department. So it takes a lot more time to build confidence and trust in relationships to allow them to come together and make plans and decisions. But when that happens, their outcomes are as good as and often better than the white families in the conference process. Very consistent findings in year 1, year 2, which tells me that there's a lot of fidelity and quality in the conferences that are happening, because people outside government are quite rightly challenging government to do things differently. They're trying to change the decision-making approach, and that is changing the outcomes. So if you get a chance to come and listen to Sarah at the Chem conference, please do. She is awesome. She's my new hero, and I'm learning loads from her. And she's leading a group of Aboriginal people who are doing amazing work down in South Australia, changing the pattern of decision-making. Early days, only done 300 conferences so far, but really good results. And, you know, fair play to the government. They are reacting to this and they're thinking about what they're doing. They're trying to change their behavior. They're just finding it hard to change their behavior. Don't we all? Don't we all? Next slide, please. So I've got a question for you, really. This is my last slide. What should we do with family decision-making in the UK? What should we do with it? Are we going to position it as a social work method where we have to research it and evaluate it and decide if it works or if it doesn't work? Or are we going to see it as people's rights, citizens' rights, families' rights to make decisions about their children before the state can move in and take over? If you said to Marley, we want to research your culture before we agree to working in your way, or research your models of decision before we agree to it, well, I'd tell you what to do. I'd say, these are our ways. But I think actually they apply to most families. I think if you ask most families, they'd say, yeah, we'd rather make our decisions than have some strangers make it about us. And they don't know us. And we just haven't given people that opportunity yet. So I do think that the fidelity and the quality of FGC becomes really important, both in terms of people looking after the process and making sure that the conferences are true to the principles, that they are enshrined in law, so people's rights are upheld to make decisions before the state does, and that you provide a genuine mechanism for partnership, not just reliant on sort of the vagaries of the bureaucracy and different social workers working in different ways. That probably this will end up outside the state system in New Zealand over time, because we've been doing conferences on industrial levels for many years and we're losing some of the quality. still getting the end results, but we're losing some of the quality. We have 4,800 children in care, which is exactly the same number as the number of children in care in South Australia. But that's a population of 1.7 million in South Australia, and we're a population of 5.1 million in New Zealand. So we're 3 times as big. So they have 3 times as many children in care and need to find a way to change their decision-making approach at the moment. And that kinship care deserves some kind of unique system, a distinct system that sits outside government, in my view, that properly supports kinship care. It's doable. It's absolutely doable. The profile of kinship care is different. Their needs are different. Their relationships are different. They don't need to go into the care system to be managed. We can do that in other ways. Of course, there'll be some children who need that for their own protection, but most of them, in my judgment, with good support and help, could be supported in a different way. So, we need to do this. We need to create this change, I think, through political pressure. I don't know how we do that. Maybe you'll have some thoughts about that. I know the Family Rights Group will have some thoughts about that. But you know, I'm grateful for all the opportunity to practice with families. I just feel privileged to do that and look at things in different ways, and delighted to be back with you in the UK. Have a chance to share some of these stories and these ideas with you. So thank you. Kia ora.
Thank you ever so much, Paul. Firstly, can I say a huge apology to our audience? We've had some severe technical issues, which has disabled our chat function. We've been furiously working behind the scenes trying to fix it, but we haven't managed to come up with a solution to that. So thank you to those who've tweeted questions and emailed questions. I'm just going to bring one quick one in first, Paul, and I'm trying to sort of roll 2 questions in together, and it's from someone who's doing some PhD research. And it's, if families decide at family group conference that the child is best cared for by a relative and other than the birth parent, do the state provide support for the carer and the child, financial, contact, etc.? And linking in with that, is that support there to ensure the relationship with the birth parent is supported and can thrive as well?
That's a great question. There's already a very strong, the last part of that question, there's already a very strong assumption that the birth parent is part of the whānau and will stay connected to the child. And the family will find ways of doing that. But essentially, there are 2 routes. If you make a decision like that, an FGC, you can do so without a legal order. You can call on the unsupported child benefit, and you can make those arrangements with the support of the government without the use of an order, or you can go and have an order and have that monitored and overseen by the courts and provided through social services. There are 2 routes you can take, and that's usually determined by the social worker's negotiation with the family over risk and resources. So those are 2 key factors that shape that. I don't feel there's sufficient support for children in kin care in the state system or outside the state system. I think both are inadequate, actually. You might say that one has more surety than the other, but then you lose some family control over decision making, because if the order's with the courts and the social worker, of course they can change it and they can vary it. They can move the child if they want as well. There's a strong culture of responsibility in Māori whānau, and the idea that we are responsible for our children. So if you start to interfere with that, you start to interfere with relationships.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm going to come over to Sean now, because I know, Sean, you have a question that you'd like to put to Paul and to discuss with him. So over to you, Sean.
Thank you, Angela. You may have addressed this in part in your last slide there, Paul, but the question I've got is, in the light of the New Zealand experience, what would be your advice to UK services regarding the maintaining the key principles that underpin the effectiveness of family group conferencing? For example, the independence of the coordinator.
Yeah, a few things. I think one is I'd put it in the law as a entitlement to children and their families, and not contingent on the decision making of a social worker, but contingent on a family making those decisions. So I think that provides authenticity and integrity, because you're giving the decision to the family, not the social worker. I do think that coordinators should be located outside of government. I've swung backwards and forwards on this for years, to be honest with you. when you're organizing a lot of conferences, having your coordinators in the department makes it easier, but then you start to compromise on things, cut corners, save money, lose some of the authenticity of the process. So on balance, for example, when I was in New Zealand as chief social worker, I was visiting some of the offices, and some of the offices had, social services offices had family group conference room. So I said, well, what's that? And they said, that's the family group conference room. And I said, well, what's it doing in here? And they say, oh, it's convenience. And it's cheap. So that's completely missing the point, because of course the family should determine where the meeting takes place at a time and a place that suits them. That's what the law says. So if you keep the coordinators outside of government, you have a greater chance that they will focus on the principles. And then I think supporting that structure, you need a reference or consultation with family, community and children about what people are doing in that organization to hold on to those principles and keep that fidelity. But that inevitably creates tensions between that organization and the government organization. But maybe that's what we need. Maybe we need some tension to create some change. And it means it's perceived as difficult and costly, but some of the stats seem to say it's more effective. So, you know, the government might be worrying about the conference taking 2 or 3 or 4 more weeks, but if they get a care order, going to have that for 18 years. So having people who are going to challenge the government and provide a different view and look after the process. The other thing I'm increasingly thinking is that sometimes families need advocates because they're not given the information that they need. The coordinator wouldn't necessarily know that. And they need good information and advocacy to help them make decisions when they're engaged with the state. And then you need some good feedback from the community on the process and how they feel it's going. And, you know, their feedback on their experience of the conference process, which we found to be very valuable. Yeah, I believe it should be outside government, which won't make me popular in New Zealand. A lot of people think it should be, but I'm just telling you what I think, right? So,
thanks, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And as I say, apologies again to anyone who had a burning question that we weren't able to access. The webinar is recorded and will be available afterwards. So hopefully, if you have any questions, you'll be able to find your answers somewhere within the webinar, or if you want to contact FRG direct, then I'm sure that's equally fine. I'm now going to hand over to Kathy Ashley, who's going to tell us a little bit more about our FGC services and our lifelong links. Over to you, Kathy.
Hi. Before I do that, though, I've got a question for Paul. So I just thought, in the care review in England, it talks about family group decision making. It's general, something that should be a right for families before their child's taken into care, but it doesn't specify that it has to be a family group conference. And I just wondered what you thought about that, and whether you think that actually there are real dangers in the way that can be interpreted if it isn't specific that it needs to be a family group conference.
Yeah, I think there is a risk with it. I think a lot of people are describing family decision-making approaches where social workers are trying to create spaces for families to make decisions, but not really shifting any power in decision-making. And as a consequence of that, their decisions are always subject to, you know, agreements about resources or social work oversight or social work decisions around what they think about the family decision. So, you know, the FGC is distinctive in that it enshrines those rights in law, and also the right to have all the information presented and the right to meet in private without any professional people present to make their own decisions without any interference from social workers. And that's probably quite significant, I think, in terms of the process. I think it's probably a bigger leap than we think. You know, I think that, I guess my reflection would be that most of us feel like we want to work in partnership with families. Most of us think we're benign in those relationships and we want to help. We're doing our best to help, and we probably are. But what we're not realizing is that from the family experience, it's quite different. from the family experience, they're not in control of the decision making. They're not leading the change. They're not leading the way things are done. They are subject to them from social workers. And I think that's a consciousness we need. And unless you have some sharp lines around the edges of what actually happens, you're still left with the social workers determining how things have been done, when things will be done, what the agenda is, where the resources can be agreed or not. So I really applaud all approaches to developing family decision making. There's some beautiful innovations happening, but they tend to be small scale and locally led. And then the leaders of those approaches tend to move on, and then they wither on the vine. They dwindle, and they don't stay enshrined in the community or enshrined in the relationship between the state and the family. And so they get lost. I think they get lost.
Thank you. And I just wanted to say from Family Rights Group a huge thank you to Paul for his talk. It's always inspiring. It's always, whenever I hear Paul, things just sort of neatly fall into place. Ideas that I've sort of had for a long time but have been sort of whirring around. And Paul always has an amazing ability to bring clarity and explain things which in simple ways, but actually complex in terms of what we're trying to address. I just wanted to talk briefly about the services that Family Rights Group can offer. So if you are thinking of setting up or interested in setting up a family group conference service or expanding your family group conference service, if you're interested in training coordinators in the family group conference principles, or if you're a family group conference service and you want to look at how you're operating against national standards and become accredited, then do look at our website and do contact us. We offer training, consultancy, accreditation. Similarly, in relation to Lifelong Links, so Lifelong Links is an approach that we developed drawing on international research, but developed with young people in care around exploring who is important to them in order to ensure that they have the relationships that they need in life, including adulthood, in order to prosper and to feel secure and to entrench their identity. So if you're interested in finding more about Lifelong Links, and it's built on the family group conference model, then do again contact us, look at our website, and there's some links in the chat. Paul mentioned the importance of family members not just being involved in relation to individual decisions about their own lives, but also in influencing how the system operates, influencing how services are designed. And we're incredibly fortunate at Family Rights Group to have a parents panel made of parents with lived experience, mothers and fathers, of which Angela was a founding member of the parents panel, and also our kinship care panel. Again, really grateful to kinship carers who participate and use their extensive experience in order to inform our work, but also to think about reforms in wider system. So again, if you're interested, if your service would like to find out more about how it can set up or extend your family panel or equivalent, then please do get in contact. We have joined up with Paul and the Kemp Centre in the United States to run a international, global, in fact, conference online this year from the 3rd to the 6th of October on changing the child welfare system. there will be presentations from around the world, there'll be discussion groups, there'll be workshops, it will cover kinship care, it will cover family group conferencing, other forms of family group decision making. It will look at the differences that Paul has addressed. It will look at systemic and systematic discrimination within our system and how that needs to be challenged. So we're in the fortunate position that we're able to offer all those who've attended the webinar today a free place on that at that conference, online conference. And the other advantage, as well as participating at those events, they take place over 24 hours basically each day to fit into various time zones, is that you're also then able to access the recorded sessions over the next 12 months. So you will be getting an email about that, but there'll be more information about how you can register. And on that note, I'm going to hand you back to Angela. I want to say a huge thank you to all the Family Rights Group team who organised today's webinar, and to yourselves for coming along. I know it was an early start, but I hope you feel refreshed, invigorated and determined to work with ourselves in order to secure the changes we want for children in our country. Over to you, Angela.
Thank you, Kathy. Well, really all that remains for me to do is to thank you all today for coming, and as I say, for being patient and bearing with us with our technical issues. But actually, if it's okay with you, Paul, I'd like to come across to you, because I loved the way that you introduced yourself, and I think it would be rather fitting if you could give us some of that lovely language again in a way to say goodbye to everyone and thank you.
We haven't planned this, but I could sing you a song, which is what we often finish. There's a song we often sing in the morning. It's called Whakataka Te Hau, and it's a song about the rising of the sun and people going to work and the sun warming people up and getting them ready for work, and going out fishing and to the towns and the cities. So it's a song we often sing in the morning. So it's night time here.
Perfect. Well, it sounds perfect for those of us where it is morning. So thank you, Paul.
I'll have a go at this. Whakataka te hau, ki te uru. Whakataka te hau, ki te tonga. Kia makina kina ki uta, kia mataratara ki tai, ehi ake ana te ata kura, he tio, he huka, hei hau, tihe. Whakataka te hau. Kia ora, te whānau. Go out, do your stuff, change the world. We're right behind you. Stay with Family Rights Group as well. They've always been an inspiration to me, and they're a great grounding place for, you know, learning knowledge, values, and keeping us true. So thanks to Family Rights Group. Kia ora.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to everybody for coming. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Take care, and we'll see you all soon. Goodbye.